Welcome, everybody, to the Illusion of Consensus podcast. I am Professor Jay Bhattacharya, and I'm delighted to have here with me Fang, who is an incredible investigative journalist. Although he doesn't look it, he's been working working as an investigative journalist for like, what, 15, 20 years, something like that?
Yeah, a little over 15 years, yeah.
Okay. I want the listeners to hear a little bit about your history, but you started out in doing investigative journalism from a political bent.
Yeah, that's right. I grew up in the Washington, D.C. area and always drawn to politics and public life. I'm a millennial, so, I watched the Pentagon burn after on 9/11 on the day. Grew up, right on the Beltway. And, the Iraq War, the War on Terror, the Bush re-election campaign in 2004. I mean, this is what I was obsessed with as a teenager. And initially, I was kind of drawn to the far left. If you're an adolescent, marching in the streets is really fun, and it feels like you're doing something, even if you're not. And from there, I just kind of I quickly realized that I wanted to make a profession out of working in media or politics or public policy. I wasn't sure. And I interned at a number of places. I ended up interning at maybe a dozen different places in politics and policy and media. And the place where I seemed to enjoy the experience and the work the most was investigative reporting. And the job that I landed at first out of college was at a think tank, the Center for American Progress, that has a fairly ideological and partisan bent. It's, it says it's nonpartisan, but it's actually, fairly pro-Democrat. And for a while, they actually had a relatively independent, and I do mean this sincerely, relatively independent blog. And we had 20 of us. It was Matthew Iglesias, Faz Shakir. A lot of people have gone on to do really interesting things. And we're writing about the first few years of the Obama administration. And that was just a really wonderful first gig in media. It taught me a lot. It also made me a little bit more jaded about politics in DC. I got to travel the country just as the Tea Party movement was taking shape, going all over Missouri and Indiana, Ohio, just talking to regular people about why they were disappointed with the Obama administration, why they wanted to join these kind of movements, and then seeing, the development of and the nexus of special interest money and public policy, and what is a real grassroots movement and what is AstroTurf. I mean, these are interesting questions. If you're a billionaire, if you're a corporation, and you say, I want to support a bill or I want to kill legislation, and you use your name, you might not have as much credibility. So what you see in DC is that you have literally hundreds of consultants that specialize just in either harnessing pre-existing grassroots groups and kind of nudging them in a certain direction that benefits a certain corporation or wealthy person, or even creating out of whole cloth entire organizations, whole networks of groups that will be the public face of a special interest. And this type of dynamic fascinated me. I saw it all over DC. I mean, it became like a multi-million-dollar industry, especially under Obama.
Well, you had one of the most important stories you ever broke, I think. I was looking through the stories you've written. Some of the stories you've written to prepare for this was identifying the Koch brothers as a funder of the Tea Party movement.
Yeah,
I should confess, there's some irony in this because when I wrote the Great Barrington Declaration with Martin Kulldorff and Sunetra Gupta, I got accused of Koch brothers funding, and it was a total lie. Like we took $0 for it. It was like one of these like Coke by association things, because the little conference we held where I paid my own way. It was held at this place called the American Institute of Economic Research in Great Barrington, Massachusetts. I think some number of years ago they'd had a conference that had gotten like $50,000 or something for to sponsor them for that conference. I had nothing to do with the conference. I didn't know anything about the place. The GBD conference had nothing to do with it. And then there's this accusation of, oh, you're Koch funded, as a way to like undermine the public health argument we're making, right? Rather than, whereas like what you're doing is you're saying, look, you should know who's funding this this effort that you're doing. You're like honestly trying to say what's fun. It's in the public interest to know public, but it's funny to have that kind of honest reporting turned into a weapon.
It's the nature of this type of political reporting. No matter, and if you're touching any hot button issue, there's going to be someone else who takes it and weaponizes it and uses it in a way that is partisan or dishonest. You see this on the right with some exaggerated claims around Soros funding, and I think it's fair to look into Soros funding. You know, that there could be some inappropriate behaviors there, some dark money. But the same thing with Coke. You know, we should ask these questions, but we shouldn't just use them to bully and silence people.
Yeah. Anyway, so that I wanted to like get that out because and what I saw was that your record is really, it's not even about politics. It's not really even about it's what it's about is like trying to understand the structures, the financing structures, the support structures that shape how we view scientific things, political things. I mean, that's really the core. Did I get it right? I mean, was that
yeah? I mean, I'm interested in everything under the sun, but that is kind of a common thread in a lot of my reporting. I like talking to sources. I like meeting people. I like writing profiles of people. I like going out and this is an incredibly large and diverse country. I like talking to people. That being said, I feel like maybe there's a lot of reporters that do that, and a lot of reporters that are probably better than me at that. But I think I have a comparative advantage in that I'm just really fascinated and drawn to original source material, into court documents, corporate disclosures, a variety of, as someone who's often reported at the margins at independent media outlets, at, small magazines or media outlets, it's hard to say when you're going up against the New York Times or Wall Street Journal that you've got a big story that they don't. But if you've got the documents, if you have the original source documents, it's a way to stand out. And it's something that I've just kind of realized by my stature in the media, kind of, that this is a way to kind of prove my reporting and to show it is to focus on the documents and to really take a look at power and how it affects people.
Yeah. Well, so I asked you on the show because you wrote a fantastic story that actually involved me and Moderna, but I'm gonna save that for the second half of the podcast. I want to go through a couple other stories that I thought were really interesting when I was reading your work that I think the listeners would love to know more about, and it's directly in the context of the podcast theme, which is the illusion of consensus. The idea that we have consensus in science, in public health, and public policy. That experts all agree on something when, in fact, they probably don't. Like they may not. Who knows, right? So one story. This is now you used to work at The Intercept, which is a fascinating outlet, and I think one of the last stories you wrote there focused on Twitter, and in particular on a online covert campaign by the Pentagon to influence how Twitter manages messages by foreign actors. It's not clear, actually, by people, anyways, saying things that the Pentagon doesn't like.
That's right. I mean, just to give your listeners a little bit of context, Twitter's transformed over the years. A long time ago, Twitter, out of all the tech companies, was one of the most outspoken in defending free speech and was opposed to any government meddling. It's always a push and pull in DC. There's government censors and government meddling. But that transformed, especially after the 2016 election, after the allegations and some real evidence of Russian interference. Russians sponsored a few, especially on social media. They spent about $100,000 on a few social media ads, mainly on Facebook. I think a little bit on Twitter. I mean, this is a few $1,000s, but of course it caused huge alarm bells in Washington. It led to threats of regulation, threats of all kinds of new government oversight. Twitter, in response, created a whole new team. They testified before Congress. They created a new disclosure page, and they said, we are against any government state-operated influence operations, meaning, governments creating inauthentic behavior, bots or fake names to kind of do the illusion of consensus, to manufacture consent, to make it seem like that the public is agreeing and discussing issues. but it's really just for lack of a better term, a disinformation campaign. Um, I was one of the journalists invited and who participated in the Twitter files. I came on a little bit later than Barry and Michael Schellenberger and Matt Taibbi, but around the same time as them. And I had been looking into this issue because there had been some reports that the Pentagon had some accounts seemingly tied to the Pentagon were creating fake news outlets that were anti-Iran, anti some of the forces in Yemen, some of the other U.S. adversaries in the Middle East. They were kind of producing exactly what the Russians were accused of. These salacious stories that Iran takes refugees and chops them up and sells their organs, and this type of thing that scares people. And I looked in the Twitter, in their internal tools and in their emails, and what I found was a really interesting story, because while Twitter was publicly telling the world and Congress that they would shut down any state-backed influence operation, they were giving velvet glove treatment to the Pentagon's disinformation campaigns. They were back pre-Elon Musk, the blue check mark was not just an aesthetic thing to distinguish elites versus the proles. It actually provided some boosting to your account. It made you more visible. You were less likely to, or you're more likely to trend. You were less likely to get the NSFW flags, or there's some back end stuff there. So the military said, we've got this secret operation. We don't want to be noticed, but we want to make sure that our accounts in Yemen, in Iraq, in Lebanon, in Jordan, in Syria, and so forth, they are influential. So we want the power of the blue check, but we don't want the actual blue check. So they made a special tool, the Twitter engineers, that gave the military accounts that power. And then the initial discussions talked about it being disclosed. In fact, you have hundreds of these Pentagon accounts that did not say that they were being operated by CENTCOM. They were being operated in Florida, in the base there, and by some military contractors. They were having conversations. These are people who claim to be, I'm just a normal Iraqi citizen concerned about X, Y, and Z. But this was a Pentagon influence op, and it went on for years. Simultaneously, Twitter was telling the world that they weren't doing or allowing any of these operations. But meanwhile, they were meeting with Pentagon leaders, with DoD officials, to help them keep this secret. They knew exactly what was going on. In fact, they were assisting them.
That's really interesting. So, Twitter in that sense was an agent of the American government.
Yeah.
But the thing is about Twitter is it's not simply just, this person posts and they're influencing Iraqi public opinion. This person posts,
that's right,
and they're influencing opinion, American opinion. I grew up in an age where I thought it was not, kosher for the American government to propagandize the American population.
So did I. These changes have only happened recently, and there are some very rational, or at least intuitive reasons. You had the rise of ISIS about over a decade ago, and there was the fear of social media recruitment. What did the U.S. government do? They created these new social media operations, the Global Engagement Center at the State Department, special office at the Pentagon. Eventually, the FBI and DHS had their similar task force, and they were thinking of ways to fight Islamic radicalization. But just as any government bureaucracy, once you create a bureaucracy that has a purpose, it's hard to get rid of it. There tends to be mission creep, and unlike radio or television broadcasts that were once maybe centered at Cuba or North Korea or China during the Cold War or in the 90s, this is the internet. Anything that you supposedly aim at a alleged enemy or adversary is going to get back to the U.S. So, the Congress very quietly lifted some of the barriers on propaganda towards a domestic audience.
I learned about the Smith-Mundt Act.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah.
Yeah, so there's been exemptions to that now.
There used to, right, it used to be an iron wall where American government would not be allowed to use propaganda tactics at all.
And that wall is not just crumbled. I'm not sure if it's there anymore. And I mean, this is an area that I think there's a lot more stories to be told. We don't really know.
Yeah.
We know that the government's spending a lot of money on contractors and internal social media operations. If it wasn't for Elon Musk purchasing Twitter, I don't know if the story that I reported would have gotten out. That was really just luck.
Yeah. I mean, it's you've sort of lifted up like a little rock, and you see a lot of little beetles running around. It's funny because like I actually in Twitter 1.0, I applied a couple of times. I joined Twitter in August of 2021 after years of telling my assistant professors not to join. Just do your science. That's how you change the world. That's how naive I was, Lee. But then I when I joined, I applied to be blue check. I'm a professor in a top medical school. I have a lot of publications. I figured, okay, I should qualify. And I'm in the news all the time because of the Great Barrington Declaration. So I figured, okay, I'm notable enough. I got back that I was not notable enough.
Crazy.
I mean, it was just one of these things where I don't really care that much. But it was one of I didn't really understand what the blue check meant, honestly, when I first joined Twitter. But it was one of these things where I look back and it's like, why did Twitter decide that? Like, what made them decide that? Well, it can't have been organic.
Well, we know that. I mean, this whole process is incredibly politicized. I mean, another Twitter Files story I did, a few stories, was just looking at the government and quasi-government connections that were shaping some of the COVID decisions, right? Just as the Pentagon and a lot of was weighing in on these Middle East operations, you had this encroaching government role. Once those floodgates were opened, it wasn't just centered on Islamic terrorism or adversaries in the Middle East. It started going after domestic dissent. The same lobbyists who helped set up, who are the point person for Twitter with the government and DoD. At first, they're just talking to the military. Then they're talking to the CDC. Then they're talking to various NGOs that work with the federal government in identifying alleged pandemic misinformation and disinformation, and deciding who's boosted and who's shadow banned. Like yourself, we found out that you were shadow banned.
Yeah.
It's blacklisted. Yeah,
blacklist.
It's an escalating issue. Once you kind of open the doors to government influence and with no transparency, it spreads.
Okay, so that's a fascinating story. But I wanted to move forward in time. You now have a Substack, a fantastic Substack, actually, with just your name, Li Fang. It's actually, I regret that Elon has a little war with Substack going on, because every time I post a link to one of your articles, it gets like 1/100th of not just your articles, any Substack article, it gets 1/100th of the engagement it kind of ought to get.
Elon, lift the embargo. Stop.
You're not doing.
Give us actual free speech and stop posturing.
Yeah. But you have a fantastic Substack, and I recommend anyone listening to go subscribe. It's really, I've learned. I can't even begin to tell you how much I've learned from listening to this. But I want to give the listeners some sense of this. You had an article just recently about a British AI firm called Logically AI, and the title is that Logically AI is poised to help censor activists and journalists, and then influence the American 2024 election.
That's right. This is, I know it's the biggest profile of this firm. It's received a lot of heat in the UK, where they were the main government partner early in the pandemic to monitor misinformation and disinformation. And just as in the US context, there was mission creep. What did they identify in their reports as mis and disinformation? People criticizing mass vaccination of children, of lockdowns, of the vaccine passports that were proposed in the UK. They were proposing much more onerous policies in many respects in the UK. And the UK was looking at government critics, even members of parliament, journalists, activists, elected officials, and they were being classified as mis and disinformation. This firm Logically had, and unlike a lot of these other companies, there's a whole cluster of these NGOs that claim to do this, but this firm grew rapidly. They use artificial intelligence to identify. Then they have a public-facing site, a semi-news site that publicizes, the biggest kind of spreaders of misinformation. Then they also have a backdoor access at Facebook. Content that they flag as misinformation gets automatically downgraded. In some cases, there's a automatic fact check that pops up. So this company had a lot of influence in shaping the discourse in the UK. They're working in India. They're working throughout the European Union. They're coming to the United States. They've already secured contracts with the DoD, with Army Special Command. They've piloted tests with the Chicago Police Department to analyze rap videos and predict crime. They're working with the Oregon Secretary of State. They already had a contract for the 2022 midterms. They're currently attempting to get a contract for this year, and they've negotiated with DHS for radicalization and election misinformation for this presidential election. So they're coming.
I mean, it's really interesting because, like, I have a lot of colleagues in the UK that were subject to, attacks by on social media and elsewhere, and suppression, including people like Sunetra Gupta, who co-wrote the Great Barrington Declaration, and Carl Hennigan, who's the director of Center for Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford. And it seems really likely that they were the targets of this company, this specific company, because they were arguing.
There's no Elon Musk, equivalent that's happened in the UK, where you have this great disclosure. We've only had a trickle of documents. There's a fantastic activist group, Big Brother Watch UK, that conducted record requests to their government, mostly redacted. But in the few files that are unredacted, you see these journalists and activists and academics, but we don't know the full extent.
Yeah, I mean, so I've been in contact with Silky Carlo. Who works with us, and actually I put in my name on their request.
Oh, good.
But my name did not pop up. But some colleagues of mine in the UK, academics, did pop up. It's funny. It's like you have this idea that there is a consensus among academics in favor of some of the public health policies that were adopted. The lockdowns, the school closures, the mask mandates, the vaccine mandates, and so on. But if you have a firm like this, essentially putting their thumb on the scale, working with social media companies, how do you know that there were more people who favored lockdown, more scientists who favored lockdowns than didn't?
No, that's a great point. I mean, and so many of these claims, even if it is disputed or the truth is out there in an election, when everything is politicized, how do you determine truth? How does the government determine truth? Well, one of the things that kind of shocked me with the Twitter files, or maybe shouldn't be too surprising, I would see accounts that were flagged by the Department of Homeland Security in their partnership with the Secretaries of State that were sending tweets to Twitter HQ to ban or remove, and it would be mostly small conservative accounts saying, don't trust vote by mail, don't trust vote by mail. That's how they're going to steal our votes. That's someone's opinion, right? Twitter was taking action, seeing that, okay, this is misinformation, disinformation, we're going to take it down. In the chats at Twitter, they were looking at Democrat accounts with hundreds of thousands of followers, people like Howard Dean, who said, don't trust vote by mail because Trump controls the post office. Don't vote by mail. Identical messages, a phrasing a little bit different depending on the speaker. But for a conservative, those accounts got deleted or shadow banned or what have you. For Howard Dean, untouched. So that was just a big pilot, the 2020 election of having these partnerships with NGOs and tech companies and these investigative anti-misinformation firms, and they failed the test, but they're hoping to expand it for this election.
I mean, it's really interesting because it's one thing for your Twitter or Facebook. I mean, if they have some left-wing bias, they up front they have some left-wing. I don't have any problem with that. Like, that's fine. That's their business. You can have Twitter and you can have Parler, and they can go at it. But I don't. But that wasn't like that. Right? It was the sense was the story was that whatever is happening, this suppression of misinformation was an even-handed thing, right? Where they're gonna have some neutral way of dealing with information about scientific information, election information, you name it. But it's not even-handed, is it?
It's not. And even though in an ideal world, we would have just unlimited choices and we would have true competition. But technology is different. It's different than a railroad or a utility. We have just a few firms that are dominant, and they use their dominance to squeeze out competition. So, you might create a conservative Twitter or a Parler. Parler was kicked off the App Store by the two big companies that control all the apps, Google and Apple. So, what do you do there? We have big tech concentration, and you have collaboration with big government and opaque private actors that claim to be acting in the public interest, but really, are they for-profit companies just trying to make enough money? Are they shadow partisan groups that are just pro-Republican or pro-Democrat trying to censor their opponents? That's not clear, and I think that's what's happening.
Yeah. Okay, and that's a good segue, I think, into when we're talking about shadowy groups, to conversations about health specifically, and some of the really fascinating reporting about health. And I promise we'll get to Moderna in just a bit.
Yeah.
Before that, you were telling me about a story you once wrote about pesticides.
Yeah, I did a long profile. I think the longest look at the history of neonicotinoids. This is a class from the 90s, relatively young, but now the most dominant pesticide in the world. And just the kind of battles in academia that Bayer and some of the other companies that had produced this pesticide and were generating massive profits wanted to suppress criticism, especially within the academic community. And as I pesticides are not my focus. I've written about them a few times, but as I spent about 6 months writing this one story, and as I kind of delved deeper into these dynamics, I mean, it was just fascinating. It was not just Bayer, and it was not just neonicotinoids. Many of the major herbicides, pesticides, insecticides that we use that may be causing issues with insects, with human health, with some mammals. A lot of these compounds are relatively new, and they're being mass used for scientists and academics that were raising questions, simply doing the basic research of how this affects non-target species. The chemical industry came down like a hammer. There was the case of Tyrone Hayes at UC Berkeley, who was studying atrazine, an herbicide made by Syngenta. Documents came out from an unrelated litigation, a lawsuit in Illinois. In the process of discovery, many documents showed that Syngenta was harassing Tyrone for researching atrazine. They were not just sending document requests designed to intimidate him, they were sending a young person to follow him around the country and record him everywhere he went, to track his whereabouts at all times, to physically intimidate him from doing his research, for simply researching a commonly used herbicide that we can find in the water in much of this country. In very agricultural states like Iowa and Illinois, you test the water, you find atrazine. It's water soluble,
I mean, it's funny because there's a history of journalism exposing this kind of Rachel Carson wrote this book called Silent Spring, exposing the consequences of DDT for birds and for the ecosystem more generally. I mean, it was a shocking expose, and it really changed things. Like the mass use of DDT declined pretty sharply after in the years after she wrote that book, and it sort of set off the modern environmental movement in some ways.
Yes.
And what you're reporting is that you currently have that problem, except at a much larger scale. And if there's a Rachel Carson around, like this man, this professor Tyrone Hayes, he's not even trying to be Rachel Carson. He's just trying to do scientific work.
That's right. If you're an academic and a researcher raising questions about a widely used compound, a product, a vaccine or a pharmaceutical product or a pesticide, and big companies realize that if the research increases the risk of litigation, of regulation, of public backlash against their product, they have every incentive to destroy that academic or researcher, to try to get their funding canceled, to kind of lobby the administrators at that university to steer them away from that research, or to even intimidate them. There's oftentimes these front group websites that will, plaster Google with "this scientist is a liar," and lots of kind of sleazy tactics like that. And as we've seen with the pandemic and the vaccine debate, many of these tactics that have been applied to researchers and scientists went mainstream, just going after anyone who were critical of these policies.
I mean, I remember the first time that happened to me. I was, it was in 2020. I'd written a paper on like measuring how widespread the COVID disease was in early 2020, and there was like a reporter doing a hit piece on me. There was like these like sort of insinuations that I'd done some like underhanded thing just by doing research. And it was really kind of shocking. I was like, and I remember the first time I saw online a call for me being fired because I published a study that someone didn't like. And I mean, it's just I thought I had thick skin, Lee, and for an academic, I actually pretty thick skin. But it's one of those things like where you just don't. It happens enough times. You just say, okay, maybe I'll just be quiet. Some of my friends who were involved in some of that early research decided to put their heads down and not stick it back up above the parapet, because it's not we as academics, we're not politicians. We're not used to this kind of fight. And so when you're in the middle of it, it just feels like it's taking away from your ability to do the work that you want to do. Why not just go in a place that where that's not going to happen?
Well, that's the intent behind these intimidation campaigns. It is to silence you. It is to prevent you from speaking up or from doing a type of research. It is designed to put your head down and stop asking questions and to stop challenging conventional wisdom. I mean, if you look at there are specialized PR firms that work for the pharmaceutical and chemical industries. That's all they do is harass scientists and researchers. That's what they sell their services as, and they plant stores with media outlets. They use their connections in the media. They work with social media in terms of placing ads and creating these kind of dummy websites that slander very good science and researchers. It's a tragedy because I don't think the average scientist is prepared for this at all. I mean, when I was doing the pesticide reporting, I talked to a number of people that gave me so much information, lots of really interesting insights. They said, no matter what, you can't quote me in your piece, even though I'm a tenured professor at a big university. They didn't want to lose their funding. They didn't want to have to put their family through all kinds of months of harassment. So, that actually, not many things surprised me. I've written about so many subjects, and it's, there's lots of bad things that happen. And I'm a little bit, I don't want to say cynical, but I'm used to it. But that actually shocked me, talking to researchers for this other story that I think is very related to what you've gone through, that it works. It gets people to shut up.
Yeah. I mean, I think part of it is, on the one hand, I having been through it, I understand the impulse, right? So it's like 2020, middle of 2020, and there's all these hit pieces, attacks on my wife, my family, like hit pieces in BuzzFeed against my wife.
Oh.
It was just like just a nasty personal attack, again, for writing a paper on how widespread COVID already was in April 2020. And I just had to decide. I was like, okay, do I keep my head down? The university was sending these signals. If I put my head down, I could go back to being, esteemed professor or whatever. And I just couldn't do it, Lee. But I think I can totally understand why so many academics would. It seems like a violation of a social compact, right? So I have a tenured position. That's a huge privilege, right? In principle, the tenure is supposed to protect my right to say what I believe, whether anyone likes it or not. That's the whole purpose of tenure, right? This whole social purpose of tenure is to create a class of people that can say true things.
Mm-hmm.
In science and in academic circles. It doesn't need to worry about what other people are saying, or certainly as far as their livelihood. But in fact, what I found is that for most professors, it doesn't work that way. Like, they get tenure and they if anything, they become more timid because they don't want to fall down the social structure.
That's interesting. And I don't know how to fix that, because I've seen that too. I hear that all the time. And that's a crisis in America.
Yeah. There's a story that your story that you were telling me about these pesticides it brought up in my mind was a story about a drug named Vioxx. Vioxx is a drug that came out I don't know, like the late '90s, early 2000s, and I forget the exact date, but the idea of the drug was that a lot of non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drugs cause stomach bleeding, stomach ulcers. And Vioxx was using a biochemical pathway that would bypass the thing that people thought would cause the stomach ulcers to happen. And so it was sold. I remember it as a drug that could be given even to elderly people who were prone to getting bleeding, because if you have pain and you want a non-steroidal anti-inflammatory drug, you can't give. If someone's prone to stomach bleeding, you can't give them Advil. You can't give them aspirin. They're gonna have stomach bleeding. And so Vioxx was like a huge thing. Like and Merck, I think, was the company that had it. It was a huge amount of money that they were looking to earn from it. The drug, there were signals that started to come up that the drug causes cardiovascular events, strokes, heart attacks, things like that. I actually remember this is like toward the end of med school, or maybe right after med school was over. I was talking to my mom, who had needed non-steroidal anti-inflammatories for right after surgery she'd had, and I mentioned Vioxx to her because I was like, I'd read the so the biochemistry of it, it got me all excited. And then a few years later, it turns out that it causes strokes and heart attacks.
I remember the headlines. It was a huge story.
And in fact, there had to be a FDA whistleblower in order to make the FDA actually put black box warnings in and sort of get the drug restricted in order for that to happen like that. And there was a story that came out that Merck, the drug company that made Vioxx, hired investigators to go and harass academics that were writing papers documenting strokes and heart attacks with Vioxx.
Exactly. I mean, this is a pattern. This is a playbook that, the company might be different, even the industry might be slightly different, but it's essentially the same tactics that they use to control public opinion, to silence dissent, and to intimidate particularly researchers and scientists.
Because we're easy targets, Lee.
Well, you're the juiciest target because, most people are just giving their opinion. To actually do the studies, the hard science that prove the health effects of these products, you have true power. People like you have power, and that's why they focus on silencing you.
I mean, the funny thing is it's psychopathic. Like, we're talking about a drug that's going to cause heart attacks and strokes in mainly older people. Older people are taking it because they want to avoid the stomach bleeding. I mean, how do you live with yourself? Like, you found this you have a product. You may put it out in good faith. It turns out they didn't. It turns out that in retrospect, even in the randomized trials, they hid evidence of this happening.
Huh.
But let's say you, in good faith, you put it out, and then some outside researcher discovers that it's having this bad thing. Wouldn't you, as a moral human being, not want to have this drug go hurt people?
I wish I knew more about the Merck case, but generally speaking, what I've seen in too many examples like this is that companies at most receive a civil fine, and if it's a civil fine, then it's often a tax deduction on a public company's balance sheet. They're serving their shareholders. They have a fiduciary interest to make profit. So that, if they can calculate the potential loss, not in human lives, but in just dollars, because they might get slapped on the wrist with a DOJ fine or what have you, they're going to keep doing this. I mean, I strongly, I don't want to prescribe any solutions for any policy, but I generally, in terms of the approach that I think needs to be taken, is criminal penalties. If you're hurting people, if you're killing people with your products, and no one faces jail time, it's going to happen again. It's going to happen over and over again.
I want to disagree with you in 2019. At this point, I've seen, it's really striking. Okay, so finally, I invited you on because of the Moderna stories. It took us 40 minutes to get to it, but I think it was a nice voyage. So you, Lee, in late November, I think, last year, you wrote a piece with the very intriguing title, "Moderna is spying on you." Um, Moderna, of course, is the company that makes the mRNA vaccine, one of the mRNA vaccines, for Pfizer being the other. Uh, and Moderna, of course, has very close links to the U.S. National Institute of Health. Some of the patents that Moderna has are held by that uses are held by the NIH, and got a lot of support during Operation Warp Speed. As far as I know, the only product it is ever put on the market is these COVID vaccines.
That's right. I mean, they're very different from AstraZeneca or Johnson and Johnson or Pfizer. For those companies, I mean, these are well-established companies with dozens, if not hundreds, of products. You know, pandemic was one golden opportunity to make a ton of money, but they're moving on already. You know, Pfizer, if you look at their recent healthcare conference in San Francisco, they're talking about the obesity diet drugs of the future. They're done with the vaccine. They're ready to move on and create their own version of Ozempic. That's what they want to focus on. But for Moderna, they're very different. I mean, this went from a small startup with basically a minuscule valuation to it skyrocketing to being worth over $100 billion. In in paper wealth, I believe it minted 5 new billionaires. Just this one company alone. I mean, created so much wealth with one product. So with all their eggs in that basket, they've done perhaps more lobbying than the other companies to retain this market share. And as the pandemic is further and further in the rearview mirror, as Americans have soured on the idea of a third or fourth or fifth booster shot, I mean, a big part of this reporting was also just listening to the investor calls. This is a public company. They've gone on and given these public presentations. You can listen to the webcast where they say, you know, people aren't taking our booster. Maybe it's the misinformation. Maybe we need more marketing. Maybe we need more advertising. Maybe we need to, you know, shape public opinion in some way. What they didn't mention, but they perhaps tip their hat to in these investor calls, is that since early last summer, they've partnered with public good projects. This is the same NGO that worked with Twitter to censor social media, to give them actual lists of accounts to either deboost or boost or straight up delete. And this is a group that was previously funded from the Biotechnology Innovation Organization. This is the lobby group for Moderna.
Okay. Just let me start just to set this.
Yeah, I'm sorry, I'm giving a lot of names out. Yeah.
No, this is really important. So this is important. I want the listeners to understand. So you have a company that has a single product. It's this one. And everything that it's made. All the successes of its billionaires come from the success of this one product. The product is dying because the COVID is receding in the minds of Americans, and people are not taking the vaccine over and over and over again like they expected, and they're panicking. They're like, okay, what do we do? And they're saying the problem is, like, it's Jay Bhattacharya, it's Alex Berenson.
Exactly.
They are undermining the demand for our drug.
Exactly. I mean, if you look at these reports, I got access from a source to these reports that they conducted on a regular basis starting last summer, when they started really getting, it coincides almost perfectly with these reports that the Americans would not be taking the next round of boosters. They were looking at Aaron Rodgers. They were looking at you. They were looking at Berenson. They're looking at Michael Schellenberger and other Russell Brand, other independent media voices that were not just, Megyn Kelly. She talked about the real possibility that maybe she received some type of vaccine injury from an immune issue that she seemed to have right after receiving a vaccine. You know, they don't know the truth of that, but they labeled it as misinformation. What they labeled as misinformation really spanned the gamut. I mean, some of the stories they flagged, one about potential, there was a headline last year, in congressional inquiry around why the CIA did not come together with their assessment around the origins of COVID. This was looked into by senators. Apparently there's a very real whistleblower from within the CIA. That's a that's misinformation to them. This is a real story that's being discussed by NBC News, by major media outlets, and they flag it as misinformation.
Well, how would they
Maybe
know?
you should talk about a little bit of what I shared a little bit of what they flagged on you.
Yeah, I mean, so like so I just tell like my the way I've dealt with the vaccine, partly was structured by the fact I knew that if I were to directly criticize the vaccine, or even discuss it in 2021 or 2022 when on Twitter, I was going to get censored. And so I was very, very, very careful about sharing studies, like high quality studies, about the vaccine. So, like, you know, when information came out about how about immunity after COVID recovery, that impinges on whether you should take the vaccine, because if you have pretty good immunity after COVID recovery, the marginal benefit of the vaccine is lower. I mean, that's just a fact, and you could see it in the scientific evidence. So I would share studies about immunity after COVID recovery with very little extra comment in order to avoid being censored. And you know, like, and stories of vaccine injuries, I would hear them, I would see evidence of them, but very rarely share them, because again, I just wanted to avoid the stigma that comes from being labeled as censored. And so I was fairly careful. As time goes on, I became less and less careful, because I thought, okay, I have more of an obligation. I mean, I'm not. What am I going to use this platform for, other than to share this kind of information? I'd say, like, my sense of what the vaccine ought to be used for and how it should be used. It seemed to me, and it still seems to me, like for older people, it might have been justified to recommend the vaccine, when even though you don't know the full set of side effects, because the marginal benefit in terms of reducing the rate of dying from disease is a big deal for older people. This disease really kills old people. And for children, I wrote an op-ed with Martin Kulldorff in April of 2021 in the Hill, saying that it doesn't make any sense to give this vaccine to children.
Yeah.
So I'm sure I got on their list. I mean, that op-ed probably put me on their list.
It's not only that. I mean, you know, there was this firm PGP, nonprofit, but they partner also with a company, Talkwalker. Now they, like Logically, use artificial intelligence to monitor millions of conversations in a variety of languages for sentiment analysis, for keyword analysis. So even if, you know, it's not someone with a lot of influence and expertise like you, if someone's making a similar critique as you, and they're profiling you as Jay Bhattacharya, here's a dangerous misinformer, sharing a dangerous link to a study, peer-reviewed study, anyone else discussing it around the world is potentially flagged. I mean, that's the power of this technology.
I would get those emails. I'd get emails from people say, Jay, I shared your tweet on Facebook, and then Facebook tagged me, and now I can't get into my account anymore.
I mean, that's just absurd.
And it was like, it was one of these things where, like, you really couldn't talk about the vaccine very, if you sort of any honest way, without, you know, it's like this. You're in the Soviet Union, and you have to, like, talk in code to make sure that the KGB doesn't know who you are.
I mean, it's you're exaggerating, but I mean, there's a slither of truth there. I mean, I've written about drug companies, hospitals, you know, the for-profit healthcare system for 15 years, 16 years. I covered health reform and variety of parts of the healthcare policy debate since 2009. When I wrote stories like this, critical of pharmaceutical companies, I had all the big liberal accounts retweeting me and sending my story out. I had Democratic politicians and interest groups, you know, blasting my stories out. I'm doing the same thing. Nothing's changed. But now only I can talk about it on niche podcasts, and this is not an insult. I love what you're doing with Robin. It's just, but why isn't this a bigger story? That's my point.
It really should be. I mean, like, Moderna basically made billions and billions of dollars based on taxpayer-funded money, and it used that money to essentially defame anyone that was sharing true facts from the scientific literature with the public at large that painted the product in a negative light. And actually, there was more to your story, which this detail really struck me in your story. you found that there were 45,000 health professionals that Moderna trained. Did they pay them? I couldn't tell exactly, but they certainly pulled them into their orbit.
That's right. Part of this partnership with PGP, this NGO, was to not just flag and identify dangerous spreaders of misinformation, but to create talking points and information materials to work with nurses, doctors, healthcare professionals all over the country. They said that they had already secured a network of 45,000 healthcare professionals, and to equip them with the facts, because in their internal documents it said, healthcare workers are, our most powerful communication tools. These are the folks who can persuade patients to take vaccines the most. So, the lines, the corporate line, the line between corporate PR and public health has been completely eradicated. Because if you're selling a widget or selling whatever, you have every right to try to market that product, get it out there. But if you're working in public health, in the public interest, that's a divine space where you can't just sell a product. Your motivations have to be the public interest and human health.
Yeah, and so for instance, a doctor that goes to a drug company lunch. Well, the drug company is supposed to tell the public about that. In fact, there's a database called the Open Payments Database, which I'm sure you've heard of.
Yeah.
Which anyone can go and search the name of their doctor, and all the drug companies are supposed to have given the names of all the doctors that came to their lunches, just so you can know. It seems like it's a reasonable thing to know. Is this person getting a lot of money from drug companies? In fact, the current head of the NIH got tens of millions of dollars from research for research from Pfizer.
Yeah, this disclosure is important. I don't. One interesting aspect of this, and this might sound minor, but it's exactly the point you're making. So they did launch. I don't know if they've sent out all the materials they discussed, but they did launch this anti-infodemic project with the 45,000 healthcare workers. I look at the site, no mention of Moderna, even though in the files that I obtained show that they're hand in glove with Moderna. Moderna is steering the reports. They're guiding the whole project. They're the ones that set this up with PGP. I look at the public-facing site that healthcare workers, nurses, and doctors are supposedly logging into and learning how to persuade people to take the vaccine. They have no idea that this is a Moderna project. At least from the last version I saw of this website, I looked at it for 2 or 3 months. I haven't looked at it in this calendar year yet. Maybe they've updated it, but no disclosure of Moderna.
So it's entirely astroturf, right? It's made to look like some scientists put together some information, but it's Moderna behind the scenes, essentially marketing its product.
And with the motivations very clear. I mean, the investor reports are crystal clear.
Yeah, even with absolutely no scruples about whether the things that they're critiquing are true or false. Right? They will perfectly happily go after people saying true things if it hinges on their product.
Yeah, and they talk about when they're flat. And I wrote, this is a 2-part series. I wrote 2 stories on these Moderna documents, and in most of the cases, they don't bother rebutting the supposed misinformation. It's just a red flag, high risk misinformation. Why is this dangerous? Because this person has reach. Because this person has credibility. I mean, that's not a public health reason. That's again, it looks a lot more like a business corporate PR decision.
And the funny thing, there's another funny. This is a fantastic set of stories. Anyone that's listening, I highly recommend to go read Lee's Substack to find them. But there was a funny, really interesting kind of detail. Those tens of thousands of doctors, they're not just saying go to Facebook and Twitter. They're saying anywhere.
Yeah.
Right. They're evangelists for Moderna. So probably more than I should reveal about myself, but I have a very large collection of video games on this platform called Steam.
Steam. Yeah.
I don't have time to play them, but it's fun to look at them. And anyway, so they're telling them, go to the video game platforms. If you see any subversive messages that might undermine the demand for Moderna on Steam, make sure to combat it there. Let us know.
Yeah, the AI monitoring is tapped into Steam. They're listening to conversations of gamers talk about vaccine issues, And actually, I saw my story got posted on a, I guess, I don't know if forum is the right word or chat room in Steam. And then I assume this is organic or maybe it's AstroTurf, but people immediately said, no, that's conspiracy talk. No way are we being listened to by pharmaceutical companies. It's like, well, the documents are right there.
Well, the funny thing, Lee, I posted your story, or linked to your story on Twitter, and I've collected my own group of trolls over the course of my time at Twitter, and for the most part, for the last year or so, they've left me alone. But as soon as I posted your story, many of them were back. Old friends trying to, with the same talking points. It's just interesting. And it's really easy to tell yourself it is all just conspiracy theory. I mean, it could be. I mean, I might be seeing things. But on the other hand, like the idea that you have a drug company that pays healthcare professionals to pretend like they're giving their organic advice when what they're doing is just spewing Moderna talking points. They're probably, some of them are paid, without telling you that they're actually in the service of Moderna. I mean, that's just unethical.
Yeah, there's been a lot of focus because of Missouri v. Biden, which you're a plaintiff too, and the House congressional committees have looked into this issue of kind of government influence, AstroTurf, pro-pandemic communications. Of course, there's been a couple stories from Twitter files and others. I think this is scratching the surface. I mean, you had such a mobilization of public health officials, of doctors, of healthcare professionals to evangelize this product. To, when we were in lockdown, the only way to really communicate was social media, to bully on social media, to kind of shout from the rooftops to take the vaccine, and that anyone who asked questions needed to be censored as a dangerous spreader of misinformation. It's part of the infodemic of misinformation. We've really just seen a focus on the CDC and a few federal agencies, but I think this problem goes much deeper, and potentially some of your trolls.
Yeah, I mean, and the fun, and like I've worked with the FDA before. One of the major things that the FDA does is to regulate what drug companies can say about their own products. Right, so that's why you have this like crazy thing where like sometimes you'll see a TV ad for a drug product, and they won't even tell you what it's for, just like these fuzzy things, and then go ask your doctor about some drug.
Right.
The reason they do that is because they have a rule that if they say use this drug for this thing, then they have to list the 5,000 side effects with the drug. And
right.
They don't want to do that, right?
Well, so just as the Pentagon kind of had a social media loophole for propagandizing the domestic American population, I think pharmaceutical firms kind of have a social media loophole for getting around any kind of disclosure, because we've got a lot of rules on payments to doctors on those TV ads you're talking about. But once they fund a third party that then organizes the healthcare professionals, where's the disclosure?
And so it's an AstroTurf kind of movement among doctors and healthcare professionals to sell a drug product to the American people.
And the average person has no idea, because rightfully so, physicians, nurses, healthcare professionals have a lot of respect in our society. They do important work. They're an important institution, but that can be corrupted like any other institution.
And that's the thing, is like once people start to understand that, that's actually at risk. It's not as if it's a permanent fact. That trust was earned over decades because, people go into these professions because, when you write an application for going to med school, what's the first thing? Why are you going to med school? It's like, I want to help people. That's got to be the motivation, right? But if it's like, you're serving the sort of the pecuniary interest of a pharmaceutical company, you can get rid of trust really fastly. It's really dangerous.
I mean, this is the crisis we're in today. We're in a crisis of trust, and it's brought upon us by perhaps the decline of newspapers and media, the role of social media, but then just the behavior of these companies and these social media companies and the government as well. I mean, there's a lot of blame to go around.
Yeah. Well, Lee, we're coming up on an hour. I just want to say, I know you say you don't want to solve, you're not going to propose any solutions to the problems, but I'll tell you, if you just keep exposing these things, keep lifting up the rocks and looking at the beetles, I think that has to be the very first step in the solution, whatever it ends up being. And I'm really grateful to you for having done that.
Thanks so much for having me. And Jay, it's always fun to talk to you. This is great, and appreciate your Substack.
Oh, thank you so much. Take care, everybody. This is Professor Jay Bhattacharya talking with Lee Fang for the Illusion of Consensus podcast. Until next time.